Hey there guys, and welcome to a special edition of the Fan Fixes series. Now this week we do have a fan fix deck for you. This was provided to me by a reader known as Psychobabble. I believe that's his in-game name as well. And we're doing something a little bit different this week. We usually do kind of a review of the deck and my thoughts and feelings on it. And in the background you will still see a whole bunch of games I have played here with this deck to test it out. But we're doing this a little bit different because I am using this actually as my subject for this week's article on puremtgo.com, so go check that out. I do occasionally run into some things that I will say in one place and not in another, so it's definitely worth reading. Also, if you wanted to check out this deck list for a change, I do actually have the deck list posted in the article. If you want to take it for a run, you want to make your own changes, feel free. So, here's the deck. It's basically a deck that was focused on kind of the Exalted mechanic, which we saw a lot of in M13. It's very interesting to me, when I saw this list because, as I say in the article, I did have a conversation with a friend recently about whether or not you could make a deck that had an Exalted focus. Now, the thing with the Exalted mechanic is the fact that in order to get that benefit, you have to have one creature attacking by itself. Now, this is often cases not so great. You want to have, a whole bunch of creatures that can all attack and get around a whole bunch of blockers, and that's really going to be your advantage there. Now, you can get some really nice creatures with the Exalted mechanic in Pauper. They are few and far between. Kind of the best example, I guess, is going to be the Pride Mage. That is something that is going to be able to, destroy artifacts, and it also comes in at a 2/2 cost for 2. Now, there are actually some decent ones. We have a handful of Pauper Exalted creatures that we did see. We get the Squires. A really nice one actually ends up being the I'm going to say this wrong, Akrasan Squire, which is the 1-cost 1/1 with Exalted. So that's really great because you can put that out as a turn 1 drop, and it swings for 2. That works really great. It brings back those old days of Savannah Lion and stuff like that. Gotta love that. Now, the deck also, he was bringing in a full copy of War Falcons, which is another great thing. It's basically a Savannah Lion that can fly. So, the deck is in blue and white. Does some really fun things with blue, mostly for things like the Aethercast Knight. And there are some issues that I found with this deck, but honestly, this article, again, or this video is not going to be so much a fan fix because he did pretty much identify the problems that I found with the deck himself in the emails. For those who are watching, kind of the biggest problem I found, there's a couple of dead cards, and then kind of I think the biggest issue was a mana issue. So I was a little hesitant going into this. Like I said, I had to have a conversation with a friend recently on whether or not a deck with an Exalted focus could work out. And I was definitely unsure of that. And going into playing these games, I found that actually you can get some real great benefits out of this, surprisingly enough. I think the real advantage here is the fact that you brought in stuff like the Aven Squire and the War Falcon, which give you a chance to get around things. This deck also runs a few copies of Thistledown Duo, which gets flying when you play a blue spell. So having those flyers available and those evasion processes allows this Exalted mechanic to become that much better because of the fact that it can, get around a wall of blockers. Too many times you play an aggro strategy, you run into this situation where you've dropped all your creatures, you've emptied your hand as fast as possible. Now what? Decks can, I found, especially with goblins, the deck can run out of steam real fast as you continue to drop creature. Now you're out of cards in your hand, you've lost any kind of card advantage, and you're in top deck mode. And that's not a great place to be in, no matter what the deck is. This deck can run into similar issues. It's a little more interesting because it is 2 colors, but when you're running these aggro strategies, you enter this occasional situation where you're sitting across from an opponent who is running a similar creature-heavy build, and now you've created a wall of creatures. You've got 4 or 5 on the battlefield, and your opponent has 4 or 5, and you sit there until one person kind of sits down and does the math and decides that it is advantage to him to actually attack into a wall of creatures. But with having these few creatures with evasion, it does give you some options to get around that. The deck also brings in the Lawkeepers, which work decently to provide some evasion, but I have to admit, with only 2 Lawkeepers in the deck, they didn't come up as often as I may have liked, and they actually played into another issue I had, but we'll talk about that in a second. Another thing I was a little unsure of is these Guardians of X. I'm gonna have to butcher this name again. Akrasa is how we're gonna say it, I guess. Um, I was a little unsure about these because of the fact that they are basically walls. Um, having the exalted mechanic on a wall, I decided, what was the point? But actually, they do come into that magical range I talk about all the time of 4 toughness, and at that point in time, they can block a lot of the big creatures, the common creatures. We'll say that the common creatures that we find in Pauper. So that was good. When looking at the options for Exalted that you did not run, you have the Sight-Casted Sorcerer and you have the Frontline Sage. Now, I really don't think that either of these are worth playing, so I think you didn't really miss out anything there. Maybe the Sorcerer could be. I mean, that at least works out to be a similar power to toughness kind of thing. It is a 1/1 with Exalted for a 2-cost creature. The colorless mana in the cost helps it out. But then that only becomes a 2/2 upon attacking. The shroud ability on it is kind of nice too, but you know, is it worth it in comparison to some of your other choices? I guess not. Now let's see. You kind of again, this was pointed out in the email sent along with the deck. The Outrider of Jest, the deck runs 2 of those, and at first I was like, oh, this is kind of a cool card, but I kind of overlooked the fact that it is a 2/2 exalted creature for a 4 cost. Now, this is something that at first may not have seemed so terrible, but playing it in games, it was awful. And this will tie into another issue I had with the deck as well, but these guys have to go. There were times in a mid to late game scenario where I could finally get the Outrider of Jess into play, and have the mana available to make the plays I wanted. So I could get it into play, and it of course made some of my flyers bigger upon the attack for the win. But at the same time, there were the times where it did work did not outweigh the times where it became a frustration. Times where I ended up with both of them in hand and nothing really to play with them. I mean, it was something that I think really has to go. I think these 2 cards ended up being the only 4 mana cost cards in the deck. So even if you wanted to convert those out to a 3 cost, you may not end up screwing up your curve too much. I had considered actually replacing these with a duo of Trinket Mage, which seems a little odd, but hear me out on this one. One of the other issues this deck has is a bit of a mana balance issue, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, the deck's only running 20 lands, so you can understand how you can occasionally come up short, but I really feel this is a decent stopping level for it. I don't think it really needs any additional lands. I think if you replace these 2 Outriders with 2 Trinket Mages, things will, it'll ease your curve a little bit, and you also have the opportunity you can replace a couple of those basic lands for a couple artifact lands. Now the Trinket Mage, of course, becomes a land fetch option, and you have those 3 Bone Splitters in there as well. Getting those is really great, because you do have this Exalted mechanic going on, but still, if you look at these creatures when they're not attacking, they're a bunch of 1/1s. So if you get that Bone Splitter out, all of a sudden your 1/1 creature now has a little bit of power behind it. So, I think having those 2 Trinket Mages could at least give you an opportunity. It's something that it gives you an opportunity to find Bone Splitters to fix mana, and at the same time, it's thinning your deck slightly, and it's not becoming a focus of the deck. If you wanted, you probably could take something else out, up the count to 3 Trinket Mages to become a little bit more of a solid focus there. Maybe if you cut back, say, one of the Guardians, maybe, and replace that for a 3rd Trinket Mage, that would work out really well. But I think the Trinket Mages could provide something to this deck that I feel like it's missing. Playing blue, I'm a drawaholic, as I like to call it, and playing blue without a draw mechanic really frustrates me at sometimes. I'm not suggesting you do it for this deck at all. I don't think it's appropriate in this deck. I don't think you could find room for it. I am, however, saying that you do have to be aware if this deck does run into that issue if anyone else is trying this out, where if you're playing cards, your strategy, it's aggro, you're dumping your creatures as much as possible, but you do run into that problem where all of a sudden you've emptied your hand and you're in top deck mode and you're hoping not to draw into a land. Another thing, I think you didn't really spell out whether or not this was going to be casual or competitive, but I do think this deck suffers from kind of a low toughness. I think this deck would be incredibly vulnerable actually to things like, Nausea, which give all creatures -1/-1, or Seismic Shudder, which does damage to all creatures. Those board wipes, it's very susceptible because you have both Squires coming at 1 toughness, the War Falcon 1 toughness, Lawkeeper 1 toughness, and that's a good chunk out of your creature base right there. The thing with Exalted is that creatures do get bigger, but they get bigger upon attack. They do not get bigger in a situation where they're, blocking. So that can be a little bit tough, and you have to watch out for that. The Aethercast Knights do work out kind of well to balance that out. I was also a little unsure, the Steel of the God. That's not the right name. Steel of the Godhead, sorry. I was a little unsure about that as well because of the fact that you only have 2 creatures where you're going to get the maximum benefit from this spell. Only the Aethercast Knight and the Thistledown Duo will get a main benefit from that card. I did occasionally play it on a white creature. You get that, at least you'll get the +1/+1 on the white creature to give it a little more blocking power. So that's kind of nice. But, actually in playing it out, because there's only 2 of them, it's not something, again, I said with the Trinket Mages, if you have 2 of them in there, it's not something that becomes a focus. It's still something you can play with and gives you a couple utility options. Anyways, so I think the first thing I would actually try doing is bringing in these Trinket Mages. The next issue I had, and kind of maybe the second thing we're going to talk about here and wrap this up, is going to be the issue with the mana base. So 20 lands, I feel, is an appropriate, I'm blanking here, an appropriate mana base, an appropriate count for it. I don't think that to fix the problem, you should increase your land count. I think if you go the route with the Trinket Mage, it might actually fix some of the problems you have with it. Unfortunately, it's never going to be perfect. I did find, I was playing these out and I was making notes to myself as I did, and I found games and I'm like, okay, I think the problem here is he needs to increase the amount of islands. So I was going to suggest adding at least 1 island to your mana count in place of a plains. That being said, I then played a couple more games and found a game where I got flooded with islands and was dying to find some white mana. So it's just, I think, going to work out as that, it's how Magic goes, especially in Magic Online. The Shuffler does occasionally work out that way, and you just run into those issues. I'm still unsure whether or not the correct count for the islands is 6, but I do feel, having those Chanceries in there does balance things out, and if you up the count on the islands anymore, you might definitely screw yourself. You really want those whites. You do need that plains available to you to make those 1-drops, I think is the more important thing, getting those Squire down and getting the Falcon down on turn 1. Falcon actually works really well with this deck for people who are just checking out this video. All of these Exalted creatures, a lot of them actually were soldiers, oddly enough, so that's something to be appreciated. I guess that's partially why you have the Outrider in there. If you do replace those with Trinket Mages, as I think I'm going to try, you do run into an issue where the Trinket Mage is not going to activate the Falcon, and the Falcon will be stuck on just blocking, but that's a chance you take. There are a lot of times with this deck, you have 20 lands, and that's appropriate, but you run into these issues with Hindering Light and with the Lawkeepers. I'm trying to think the best way to describe this. You're playing this deck as an aggro deck, and there's not a lot of control available to it. The Journey to Nowhere works as decent control. I don't think I would try replacing those with Oblivion Rings. That would screw up your mana curve too much. The Journeys work really well. But when you have the Lawkeepers and the Hindering Lights, I understand the purpose of them, and I kind of like the purpose of them. But at the same time, you have to leave mana available to them. And I found, 20 lands is an appropriate level, but you do run into issues where you run into points in time where you have plenty of land at 3 or 4 on the field, and you really don't need any more than 3 or 4 lands. Hopefully those come in two colors, 2 whites, 2 blues, but any more than 4, you really don't, it becomes a bit of mana flood. With this kind of curve, that's very true. But when you bring in something like Hindering Light and the Lawkeepers, all of a sudden you're in a situation where you need to have mana available. So that 4 land that you have on the field, if you have Hindering Light in your hand, you want to keep 2 of that open, which means that you can no longer play a Thistledown Duo or a Steel of the Godhead unless you're in a situation where it's appropriate, and you have to play a little more cautiously. Several times I found I would get 2 Hindering Lights in hand, and a Lawkeeper on the field, and I'm sitting there and kind of playing very cautiously around them because I don't want to drop anything. I want to keep mana available for Hindering Light, which would take out some of the targeted kill that you definitely need to be aware of. The draw on it is really nice. I do like that, but the Hindering Light I'm not entirely sold on. I do like the draw on it, but at the same time, when you're playing it against stuff like Izzet Post, I found myself in those games when they would bring out the kill spells, I would go to Hindering Light, and then my Hindering Light would get countered. I've lost the counter spell, I've lost the draw, and I wasted that 2 mana that I held open just for that. I've considered what replacements I might have made for those, and I really don't know. It's very tough because I was like, maybe if you wanted to keep a counter package, you could go with something like Mana Leak, and that would avoid the double blue problem. At the same time, I don't, you would lose that draw, and while it's 4 cards for a cantrip, it's still a bit of draw, and a bit of draw is such a great thing. Maybe you could experiment with cutting it down to 3 and trying that. That way you would run into less opportunities where you run into 2 Hindering Lights in hand. That would give you some options there. The Lawkeepers are good. I did, like having those there to get some creature through on the attack. There are a lot of decks, like Izzet Post, which is very popular currently, that have very low creature base, so if you can tap something out to get the attack through, it works really well. I know you said you tried Dodge? Artful Dodge? Yeah. Artful Dodge. Sorry, I had to look here. I really am not a fan of Artful Dodge. You're right, you do get 2 uses out of it, but it kind of keeps you very heavy on blue, and I feel this deck just does not want to be there. I feel like the deck really wants to keep on the white end of things. Again, you want to make sure you hit those 1-drops really well. I feel like the Lawkeepers, like I said, at 2 is something that I just didn't encounter enough. I wanted to encounter them more often. Maybe if you talked about replacing Journey to Nowhere for things like Artful Dodge and the Shadow Rift. If you wanted to go that route, maybe instead, I don't know, replace the Lawkeepers. It does kind of give you a disadvantage with the fact that you cannot tap out things like the Crusher. In those matchups, there was a lot of times where it was actually very beneficial to me to be able to have that Lawkeeper and tap it out when I did find it. If I have to sum things up here, as I think I will, because I think I've hit all my points here, but there's a lot of possibilities for changes. I would look at the Lawkeeper and the Hindering Lights. I am going to consider cutting Hindering Light down to 3. I'm not quite sure yet what I'm going to increase. Maybe I'll use that 3rd Hindering Light for my 3rd Trinket Mage. But I am definitely going to suggest the Outriders being cut to Trinket Mages. Now, for those of you who follow my YouTube series and have listened to my fanfics videos before, usually because of time constraints, I do not have time to make the changes I suggest, and I offer them to the person if they, make the changes and want to let me know how it went. Please do. I would love to know. Some people have. Now, that being said, this time around I am going to make a quick video, do a couple of games with my changes, just to see how it went. Just to show you guys, because this is an article and I'm trying to fill a little more space this time, just see how it goes. So this week we are going to do it a little different. I'm going to put up a quick video after this that shows my playthrough with some of the deck changes, just to see how it all worked out, just to add a little content for the article there. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Check out the article, and that other video will be up shortly.